Okay, so when we start looking at different types of programs, one of the things that we can immediately delineate is basically between programs with high amounts of training stress and programs with low amounts of training stress, and difficult versus easy training programs. And the primary constraint we're always going to have in terms of having an easy versus a difficult training program is always going to be time. In order to have training programs that have higher amounts of training stress, we need more time to train. You're not going to have a very difficult program if you're only training 1 or 2 days a week. And because the overall training stress of your program isn't very high, it's going to minimize the results that you can get on your program. Now, if we're comparing two training programs and we want to hold constant the absolute amount of training stress in terms of the RTV value, we find that there's two primary approaches to programming. One is going to be the high volume approach, and one's going to be the high intensity approach to training. So one is not necessarily better than the other. They're going to be appropriate at different times. So when we start looking at training programs, we're utilizing predominantly higher training intensities. These programs are going to work best on those styles of programming where we have less time to train. The reasons for this is that with higher training intensities, we tend to get more bang for our buck in terms of creating a training effect with less time. And we tend not to run into issues that we would see with programs where we have more total hours every week to train because we have ample recovery time between our training sessions. Now, with high volume training approaches, we start looking at cases where we're training every day or multiple sessions a day kind of deal. The number of hours we're training every week can get pretty high. And in these cases, we start running into issues of recovery. Now, granted, when we start training for more total time compared to less time, the amount of progress that we're going to make is going to increase pretty substantially. We're always going to see faster progress with more training hours, provided that we're eating and sleeping enough and we're not overtraining. Now, the downside to increased number of training hours is the risk of overtraining injuries starts to increase. And overtraining can take the form of psychological burnout. It can take the form of metabolic recovery. We're not eating enough. We're not able to replenish the substrates we utilize during exercise, or most frequently, especially when we're doing a lot of strength and speed training or training where there's a lot of high peak forces involved, we start running into issues where the connective tissue we start seeing injuries to connective tissue. Connective tissue is generally going to be the thing that's most prone to overtraining injuries because the turnover rate of connective tissue is going to be a lot slower than what we see from muscular tissue. So whereas with connective tissue, especially with like minor injuries, we often see recovery can take weeks or even months at times to heal even small injuries fully, whereas with muscular tissue, recovery takes place on the time span of days or weeks. So the primary means we have of preventing those overtraining injuries to the connective tissue is going to be reducing the peak forces on the body and reducing the intensity of our training sessions. Now, that being said, we don't want to unnecessarily decrease the intensity of our training sessions too much, because what happens is we reduce the training intensity too much. Well, then we start running into issues where the training that we're doing is not necessarily relevant to our goals, and that extra time spent training at these really low intensities doesn't really do a whole lot for us other than to impair our recovery. So often what we find is that in order to prevent what a lot of people will commonly refer to as jump volume, then we kind of set like a cutoff value first. So once we have to reduce our training intensity past a certain threshold, then we're not going to increase our training anymore to accommodate it. So usually in that case, we might say once we have to reduce our training intensity under 50% of what we intend to perform at during competition or during our goal, well, that's what we're going to refer to as jump volume. Now, what that value is going to change depending on the context of the program, but usually as a good rule of thumb, 50% is a pretty good cutoff in terms of your training being relevant for your goals. So whether, if you're like a speed athlete and you have to reduce your speed to under 50% of what you're going to try to do during competition, you're a strength athlete, once you're training with weights that are less than 50% of what you're going to lift in competition when you're doing your actual high force type movements, that's what we would call that jump volume. So the main point of trying to increase our training volume in those contexts is to increase the amount of volume that we can do above that threshold.